Today on the Cameron Channel podcast, I am joined by Flora Qian. She is the author of South of the Yangtze, which is a debut novel based upon her growing up in China and Hong Kong in the 1980s. And there's lots of interesting. I was been reading through the presser. Lots of interesting. They've sent questions. Lots of interesting things, and lots of. I think in the West we do not understand China. We have never understood China. They are a 4,000-year-old civilization, which means we're not even a country yet as far as China is concerned. We're barely even existing. At 248, we're not even on the radar yet. So this should be very insightful to understand, especially in the years of the one-child policy and the transition from real hard communism and great leaps forward in the Cultural Revolution to maybe we'll try some capitalism. That capitalism could be nice.
Right.
Welcome, Flora, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be
Oh,
here.
good, thank you. So, why don't we start right off after my hilarious intro? Why don't we start right off? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your book and how you came to write it?
Right. So the book was published last year in Hong Kong by a local Hong Kong publisher, Proverse. So Proverse has this annual international competition for unpublished work in fiction and poetry. So I was fortunate to have won the prize last year. So the book starts with the protagonist, Yinan, um, riding the high-speed bullet train in China with her American husband. So she was in her mid-30s, and that trip reminds her of her first journey through the same route when she was a child in the 1980s. So at the time, she was living with her grandparents, and her grandfather was a historical counter-revolutionary who was imprisoned by the Communist Party. Her grandmother was semi-literate. Her father was a philosophy professor, and her mother used to be a Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution. So later, when Ina was in school, she received a nationalist education and she befriends with a classmate who even aspires to join the Communist Party. And when Inan was in high school, she found herself trapped in this secret relationship with her high school teacher, who was once an activist during the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest, which, as many people know, ended up in a horrible massacre. So, amid these formative relationships, our protagonist contemplates on her nation's ideology, tradition, and even the written language itself. So she decides to push the boundary of her thinking with a different tool. So she starts using English to read and write as much as possible. And that eventually leads her to leave her hometown, Shanghai. So that is the basic premise of the story.
Very nice, very nice. So my guess is that this was you a bit of a self-writing, you writing about yourself through fiction.
Yeah, so it is definitely, I write in first person. I know that I'm gonna get this question right now.
Yeah.
It is definitely inspired by my childhood growing up in the 1980s and 1990s. And the events, some of them are fictional. So do the characters. So for example, I have
Well, that's
the
the nice thing about fiction.
grandfather
We can make
character.
things slightly more exciting than in life.
Right. Yeah, it's the characters, a combination of people I know. The grandfather was, both my paternal and maternal grandparents, and also a brother of one of my grandparents. But I always say that in fiction, what is more important is the emotional truth, right? Instead of the factual truth. So I think even though the grandparents is a mixture, but my feelings for my grandparents are real, and so does my feelings for that particular generation. Um, so I think I always think what is a more important question here is the authorial distance, right? So where does the author stands um, in terms of time from the events, but also the level of awareness about what do these events mean. So I think in my book, the narrator Yinan is definitely older, and she's in her mid 30s, and she's looking back in terms of time. On the other hand, she is awakening to herself for the first time, um, and looking at her uh, past experiences and her old world with a fresh new perspective. So she is transforming as she is narrating the story. And that is the kind of intimacy. I think the emotional distance here is very close. And I wanted to create that kind of poignancy, especially, for coming of age kind of novel.
Yes, absolutely. Um, what I mean, give us a give us a flavor. What was it like in China
Mhm.
in the 1980s?
All right. So it was
Mostly
really just
because, as I said in the intro, it's an
right.
enigma. People don't really understand it.
Mhm.
They don't get it. So give us a little flavor.
Right. Yeah, so I consider myself as a millennial, right? I was born in the 1980s, but the millennial in China, from China, and the millennial growing up in the US is so different. Even though we share a lot of things going into the 21st century, social media and the internet and all that. But in the 1980s in China, it was really just a few years after the Cultural Revolution, which ended in 1976. It was a very traumatic period of history in China, and everything was just picking up from the ashes, really. And poverty was everywhere. And I remember when I was a kid, my parents used to tell me that um, everybody earns 36 yuan a month. Everybody, regardless of what you do. It was planned economy, so we had a saying at the time, building atom bombs was no better than selling tea eggs on the street because, it's the same monthly salary. But then suddenly the planet economy shifted towards market economy and people don't earn the same money anymore. So I think in this process of many state-owned companies changed into private in the 1990s, a
Mhm.
lot of my relatives, adults I know, got laid off and they lost their identity belonging to this work unit their whole life. And later on, just a few years later, the same adults I knew went into the stock market and got very wealthy very quickly. So it is really a transformative time, and this drastic change of game rules and values, societal values, was very confusing for my parents, and I think especially so for us who grew up in this era.
Yes. One I think also, and I don't know if you probably feel this more than I do, but I think it's also, because it meant they mentioned, with the one child policy. In America, there's
Mm.
so many more, like millennials is America's large. It was the boomers were a big generation, and the boomers had a lot of kids. So we've had
Mhm.
these two giant generations now. And obviously that wasn't possible in China because they had the one child policy to try to
Mm.
cause the population decline that they're now fretting about. It's like, well, no, that was a decision. So, self-inflicted wound there, sort of thing. And so, I mean, did it, like what, I mean, for children, did you feel lonely? I mean, how much were you
Mm.
conscious of, there's not many kids around, a lot of adults, not so many kids anymore.
Yeah, certainly, definitely lonely. I think I think like the China has always had a history of favoring as many children as possible. My parents, my father has three siblings, my mother has six siblings. So that
Right.
was normal in their generation. And yeah, like you said, I suddenly grew up in a household filled with adults and not so many peers. Um, I think, yeah, apart from all these reported repercussions, like the gender racial imbalances and forced abortions and all that, I think
Right.
loneliness is accompanying me growing up. And because my parents, they lost so many opportunities during the Cultural Revolution, so they were very busy after that. They were making up for that, and they put a lot of expectations on us. Um, so we had a saying at a time, expecting your son to become a dragon and your daughter to become a phoenix. So we had a lot of pressure to excel in school and later in life. And I think that kind of push only increased the competition and isolation and loneliness. So I think that was actually one of the major reasons I went into reading and writing in the first place. I felt like I have to get out of this very small circle I had in real life. And I always craved this, deeper connection with people, not just superficial. And I found that I can talk to anyone in time and space, through reading. And that was elevating for me. So, yeah, so that was my best thing for a long time. And I think as I grew up, I wanted also to be that person um, for other people as well. Any book is not for everybody, but maybe there's somebody who would relate to my experience as well.
No, no. When it comes to being pushed hard to overachievement and the resulting burnout, congratulations, you've had the typical American millennial experience. We were told no, don't have sex, don't get pregnant in high school, don't do drugs, go to college, all this type of thing. I mean, that was congratulations, you're now like the median American millennial. And so, and I mean the people complain ask now like why is everything so high stakes? And people forget that started. I'm 36 years old. That started with people at my age of, oh,
Hmm.
for your college application to do this, to do that, all this sort of things like that, that started in the early 2000s. And because the economy is so competitive now, it's just not quite China levels of and people do crazy things. And we're not anywhere close to Japan or Korea or anything like that. But it's just ramped up more and more and more to where, nowadays, a lot of kids don't even, I mean, once you hit 12, 13 years old, you don't even have childhood anymore because everything is taking the next more advanced class, doing travel sports, hoping to get a scholarship to go to a better school or whatever have you. People make videos waiting in bated breath to see if they got into some top flight school and all this type of thing. And it's and so I think that's, I don't know that that's healthy. I don't know what your opinion, but I don't think that that's not, but there are a lot of people, a lot of us who escaped into doing other things to kind of get out of that rat race. Not everybody necessarily wanted to do that. And it's extended into adulthood now because, if things are so economically precarious, like if you didn't go to a top flight school, it can be hard to get a good job. If you didn't, which I suffered from, I went to a middle tier state school, nothing exciting, no one knows it, it's not a name brand sort of thing. I went to name brand grad schools, but and so it's everything's so competitive. And so I was wondering, especially, if as people were coming of age in the time when China's up to capitalism, has joined the World Trade Organization, gets most favored nation trading from the United States, and you have this massive economic expansion so very quickly, and how competitive it was. Um, how did you slash your character navigate what I imagine was a pretty crazy time with a lot happening in a very short period of time?
Yeah, right. So I think as I remembered, I had a pretty good childhood up until school starts, right? And after that
Right.
started, there was a lot of pressure to compete in a lot of even ex curriculum activities. And I think I actually started learning English pretty early on too, because my father was self-tutoring me. Because, with the perspective of China is going to join the World Trade Organization, and this is useful, right? But I think um, actually through this very utilitarian approach, I I have become familiar with another language very early on. And I feel like for me, this was liberating. I now have a different tool and so very different from Chinese from a linguistic perspective. Um, yeah, so that was wonderful. I definitely didn't enjoy the pressure at the time. I remember I was so the Chinese method of teaching English is basically reciting, reciting all your textbooks. I now remember as a young child, I was crying in my parents' living room because I had to do that. So yeah, that was really difficult. The competition was fierce. We have usually a class we have like 50 students, and I think in my time everybody wanted to get into science because that's what the government favors. So they don't want to encourage, liberal arts and critical thinking and all that. So even though I didn't like science, but I felt, that was the path I had to take. Until later, I finally made a change. Yeah, but that was quite a journey because everything was so programmed, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah, I just imagine the mood was quite, and especially, I mean, with you going, you talk about you going into science, that's what the government was looking for, and it being so fiercely competitive. That just sounds, I'm sorry, that sounds bone crushing. Like it just sounds so crushing. So yes, but then I also get now why your writing became so liberating because it was your escape hatch from that whole thing. So
Hmm.
I definitely understand that. So now I understand. So you said that in the book that the character is married to an American husband. How did they meet?
Mm. It was not explored in the story.
Oh,
So that
huh.
was just part of the backstory in the first chapter. I want that just to be a trigger for her journey into the past. Yeah, I didn't really explore that relationship in the story. I have an American husband myself.
Yes. Well, someone's got to hold the train car seat down, right? That's that. No, that's exciting. That's exciting. Yeah. Well, how did you guys meet?
We used to work in the same building. I
Oh, how
used to work
convenient.
in a yeah, right. I used to work in the financial sector in Hong Kong for a while. And then I quit my job. I went to the US for my MFA in 2014. I did that for 2 years.
Nice. Where
Yeah,
did you get your
before
MFA
before that,
from?
University of Maryland.
Oh, very nice. I got mine from Goddard College, just finished in 2023. So
Yeah, okay.
that's yeah. But no, I no
Congratulations.
University of Maryland has a great program. I know people who've been in that program. So yeah, that's one of the things they mentioned in here was referencing Chinese folk tales. Now, I
All
love
right.
a good folk tale, and I think all
Mm-hmm.
of Southeast Asia has just the best folk tales, I think. Although my dear friend Masha Shukovic, who is from the former Yugoslavia, would argue that South Central Europe folk tales are better. But what is
Mm.
this referencing about Chinese folk tales? How did you fold those in? That sounds interesting.
Right. Yeah, I've always been interested in that. So I think folktales, for a lot of people, there is our earliest stories, right? So I grew up with my grandparents. I lived with them, like the protagonist in my story. So they always have this regional opera called Yue Opera on the television, and yeah, so those are some of my earliest stories. For example, I mentioned in my novel there was the story of Xi Shi, uh, who who was this beautiful woman responsible for the war between two neighboring kingdoms, a little bit like Helen in Greek mythology. And later on, of course, you realize what kind of unconscious bias that kind of story creates, right? Because women are often seen as scapegoat for the downfall of kingdoms. Sometimes people don't reflect on history as they should be reflected upon, but blame women. Um, and some other stories, I think, especially those with fantastical elements, I think are expressing people's wishes in the face of tyranny or, the fleeting life itself. And I like the story of, this ordinary woman whose tears broke down the Great Wall because her husband died building for it.
Mm.
And there is also the story about a white snake transformed into a human form and married an intellectual, and she became a doctor, curing all sorts of, difficult diseases. And she was eventually captured by a monk and locked up in a pagoda in Hangzhou. Yeah, so that one got a sad ending. And the most famous is the story of Monkey King, who who does not have parents. Monkey King was born out of a rock, and he's really rebellious. He doesn't listen to anybody. Um, he steals from heaven. He went to hell, and in order to become immortal, so he crossed off his name from the life and book and death, and nobody can do anything about that. Um, so I grew up with these stories, and I think in my novel I mentioned a few, but I like to continue exploring that because I think, a lot of writers, academics, they're looking at these old classics with, new perspectives in the era of, feminism and all that. And I find revisiting Chinese folk tales very rewarding for me as well. So, and I have a 3-year-old daughter. I'm just starting to introduce to her some of these Chinese folk tales. And yeah, I want to continue doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's very exciting. There's I think I always love how those kind of get preserved in culture no matter what. They tend to survive for long periods of time. We have several, I'm sure you're aware of, it's Humpty Dumpty, Cinderella, Snow White, all this type of thing. Disney has monetized some of these. But there's also like
Right.
Hansel and Gretel, I mean all of these kind of odd stories. A lot of them German, a lot of them from Germany. But
Very dark. They're very dark.
the book says Brothers Grimm, emphasis on Grimm for a reason.
Right.
Like it's yeah, that's very interesting. In the course of the book, did you find it difficult to sort of introduce the reader to Chinese culture for those of us who don't know
Right.
enough to keep up?
Right. Yeah, I think when I was writing it, especially the first draft, I wasn't thinking about the reader at all. I think, I believe that is actually the way to write a book. So I was writing for myself. I had these unresolved feelings to figure out in regards to migration and about politics, about everything. I wasn't thinking about the readers at the time, but in later revisions, um, and then during the editing process, I do pay more attention. I think it's a very fine balance, because too much explanation um will interrupt the flow, right?
Yeah.
But I don't want things to be out of context. I think some writers, like Junot Diaz he made this decision to explain very little and ask the readers to walk an extra mile to meet him there. I think compared to his approach, I'm still more traditional. I usually will translate the words when they're in Chinese and give a little bit backstories, not too much, so that the events are not out of context. But I think if the reader is interested and wants to move a little bit closer to the narrator, they can. I hope they will be inspired by these cultural references and to learn more about it.
Yes, no, it is. I mean, especially nowadays, we can just pick up our phones and give a quick Google, and there's
Right.
something to read somewhere about it or something like that, which is very nice. We didn't have that luxury back in the day, so it's
Right. Yeah.
um yeah, it's a lot easier now. I remember one summer I was rebuilding my parents' backyard and I listened to the complete history of China on tape. Yes, tape
Yeah.
on cassette that I had gotten from the library. And I would just be doing landscaping and I would just swap out the cassette, change it over, and just keep all the way through.
Mm.
That's how we had to do it back in the days, kid. We had to listen to cassette tapes to find out
Yeah.
about things. We couldn't just Google.
Uh,
So it's yeah,
yeah. I
it's
remember. I remember. I have fond memories with cassettes
yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
Yeah, it's I'm kind of curious about this in terms of how you experience culture and language because
Mm.
I'm always impressed by the sort of bigness and lavishness of Chinese culture. On TikTok, there was this
Mm.
live I came across one time that I definitely was Chinese, and it was they were doing some sort of I couldn't understand, so I didn't know what they were up to, but they were up to something with like these elaborately dressed characters called the Nine Heavenly Bodies, and sometimes you'll catch a bit of television or a bit of a movie or whatever have you, and it's all so very big and so very lavish. I imagine coming from that to how we do things in the West, which is
Mm.
boring in comparison. What was that like for you? How was that as an
Mm.
experience? Like, sort of that cross-cultural thing, because we just don't do it the same way they do in China.
Right. I think in comparison, of course, it's a generalization. China is still very much a collective culture, right?
Yeah.
I like to draw this analogy between, Chinese painting and literature, and things in general. Because you see a classic Chinese painting, there's the landscape, and you have mountains and trees and clouds, but people figures are small, right? And their expressions are very vague because we don't care what they think about. But more importantly, is that they are part of this natural scene and they are in harmony with nature. And you see, this the grand Chinese dance, for example, that is a lot of people doing the exact same thing at
Yes.
the same exact same time.
Yes, yes, yes.
Um,
No, hey, no one does a big public parade like China. Like,
right, right, and I think it's of course, in the US, I haven't been here for too long, but I think my very first, cultural shock, as you would say, is I was impressed by how people were so upfront and unapologetic of their needs and desires. And, you know, I think coming from a collective culture, I feel that this is often judged upon.
of
And
course.
people don't think of this as like a win-win situation. They put the personal at odds with the collective. And they praise the sacrifice you make for your family, your community, and eventually for your country. So I think this was taught at a very young age. Um, so for me, this is not, this unreasonable selflessness is not right for a young child because I have a young child now. I know that the egocentrism is a matter of fact and it's a phase of life, right? And people eventually, with the gentle parenting and with encouragement, they grow out of it. And because their base are strong, they have the capacity to tend to the needs of others. But I think in China, because this selflessness is emphasizes starting from a young age. So I remember when during Chinese New Year, me and my cousin, we would sit at a dinner table with my grandparents. My grandmother would be cooking in the kitchen, and we would compete with each other. Who is going to be the first to call grandmother to dinner so that we can be praised by our adults? I think we, from a very young age, we know how to put up on a show in front of people we know. Um, but that kind of desire of individualism was so very suppressed, and that can result in people being selfish in front of outside of their community, in front of people they don't know. So yeah, like some of the tourists, Chinese tourists in foreign countries, right?
Yes.
I think, yeah. So
When
it
I was in
needs to have a
Paris, I
balance.
made sure to stay 10 minutes ahead of the Chinese tourists. They have no chill. That's, when I saw them, I'm kind of like, oh, let me hurry down this hall. Like, because, yeah, 'cause, I mean, push, shove,
Yeah.
it's just, yes. I remember there was a movement from the government several years ago to they give out pamphlets how
Mm.
to be more polite when you visit the West, sort of thing. Like planning to visit the West, here are some things to consider, sort of thing. Because we're getting a
Right.
reputation, like, and so
Yeah,
it's
right,
yeah,
right.
it's what I think there's also that at least I've found because it's all about that personal network and that personal relationship. There's kind of two sides to everybody. Like in your personal network of relationship with people you know, there's sort of one thing you can do, one way to act. But then if they're not in that network, they can kind of, screw them sort of thing, which I thought that was an interesting way to construct a society. It's not wrong or bad. It's just it just seems so closed to me. Like it just, in terms of,
Yeah.
it's not very welcoming to other people or outsiders and that I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. I think in a society that has a very long history of, censorship and, authoritarian leaders, that kind of thing, people have this natural lack of trust for others outside of their close knit community. Sometimes that only means family, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes not even family. For times like the Cultural Revolution, people don't even trust people within their family.
Right. No, no, yes, yeah, there was kind of a high trust versus low trust society, and that I've heard one of the difficulties. I used to have a client years ago who was kind of the guy to do, if you were going to do business in China and manufacturing in like Shenzhen and elsewhere, this was the lawyer you hired to navigate the Chinese legal system. And he talks
Mm.
about, and it was the first time I heard about, how important these personal relationships were and all this type of thing. There was sort of this, back in the day, this sort of trope about, gift giving to curry favor to get in with people and all this type of thing, and it's just a very
Mm.
different it's just a very different way of interacting than other places. But it's to me it's endlessly fascinating. I just enjoy hearing about it. So it's
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, I think what you're talking about is 关系, the connections, and
yeah,
yeah, because often in throughout the 2000 years, it's the people who make the laws, right? And the laws
right,
can be changed by people and whoever is in power, right?
yeah, yeah. The key to survival: get close to those in power. That's Yeah, but yeah, we not too far from that here in the West ourselves. It's we have a long tradition with Magna Carta and all of these foundational documents to try to create a system that moves away from that and towards
Mm.
common rule of law instead of the whims of individuals. So,
Mhm.
and a lot of people died in that effort. That was very
Mm.
bloody progress to get to that. Um, what's the thing you miss most about China or Hong Kong?
Mm. Um, it's really funny thing. So I moved to Hong Kong in my early 20s and I lived in Hong Kong for a long time, I think on and off, over a decade.
Mm,
So when I first moved to Hong Kong, I missed the seasons, the four distinct seasons, when
yeah.
I grew up in Shanghai. And Hong Kong had long summers, 9 months of summer and 3 months of very mild winter. And now migrating for the second time in my life, the four seasons are back. I'm
Yeah.
in New York now, and
Oh,
somehow
nice.
this, yes, twice displacement somehow set one thing right. So, I think of course I miss the food. Shanghainese is a very distinct cuisine in China. It's often trending towards the sweet side. And I think in Hong Kong, because after the communist takeover in the 1950s,
Mm,
lots of people from Shanghai moved to Hong Kong, lots of capitalists and later refugees. So in Hong Kong, we can find, restaurants for all kinds of flavor from China. So I have a lot of authentic Shanghainese restaurants to go to. So in some ways, in some sense, Hong Kong is this perfect halfway place for Chinese immigrants who are not fully resolute to leave their cultural homeland.
yeah.
So I think, you know,
I'm only 2 hours from New York. You and I need to have dinner at some point. Because one of the things I miss about the West Coast is the variety of, especially Asian cuisines. Like, I used to joke, I'm kind of
mm,
like, it's like, this is Seattle. You don't say Chinese food. You need to specify the province because we have restaurants for that.
mhm.
We have one place that just does Szechuan. We have one place that just does Cantonese. You're going to have to drill down because we've gotten
Right.
specific here. Like,
Right, right. Yes.
and
Yeah,
I
they're so
miss that.
different.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, food is part of a very important culture. Um, and I think during the height of the Hong Kong protests in 2019, it became very clear, clearer to me that I will migrate again. And I think at the time I felt a lot of sadness and this predestined nostalgia. Um, so I remember there is this Hong Kong local band called My Little Airport, and they have this song singing about wanting to fly away, but misses home the moment she lands. So after so many years, I still cry to this song every time I listen to it because the lyrics are so beautiful, and it's also the lyrics are in Chinese. It's the language that I started to use less and less.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think migration, it is a multi-generational effort, right? And you always lose something when you gain something else. So I think everybody has to make their own peace with it.
Yes. Do you have Apple TV?
I don't
You should
actually.
sign up because there's this really cool show with Nicole
uh,
Kidman called Expats that's set in Hong Kong.
ah, I
And
read a book.
yeah. It's quite good. The episodes are long, they're an hour and a half, so I haven't watched a ton. But
Hmm.
if you're feeling looking for home, put that on. Like I recommend. And it actually goes into themes of migration from it's like it's told from three different
Mm,
perspectives, including people from mainland,
right,
some
right.
people from Australia, all this type of thing. So it that could be a new comfort show. I recommend. I recommend.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I will check it out.
Yeah. So it's quite no, I feel that I've moved every 2 years of my entire adult life all over the
Hmm.
United States. So I was in Seattle for 10 years. I was in Wilmington, Delaware. I'm currently in Connecticut, because my apartment's being remodeled. Um, and I'm originally from Denver, Colorado. So I've been in the middle
Oh,
and both
okay.
ends. And there's advantages to every place. Now, obviously, I didn't have to have any language barrier, but our country is so large. move to a different coast, it's like moving to another country. The grocery store is different, the
Hmm.
gas stations are different. Nothing is where you think it should be. The cultural background of the people there in the West Coast, it's very Hawaiian, Asia focused. In the East
Mm.
Coast, it's European focused. So I can get a great pizza because there's tons of Italian people. I can get a great pierogi. There's lots of Polish people. No hope for sushi from Japan. No hope for decent Szechuan cuisine. That's not gonna unless I go into New York. And so
Mm.
and I definitely, there's lots of times where it's kind of like, oh, it'd be nice, to go back maybe, or all this sort of thing, and it's kind of never the same. Um and there's, fond memories of every place and all this type of thing, and there's lots of music and things that will remind me of, great fun times. And of course I have all these friends that I've made in all these different places, and they're really cool to talk to. And I don't know if you feel this, but sometimes I feel like I don't belong anywhere anymore. Like,
Mm.
and I don't know if I mean, in terms of, I mean, it was probably fairly easy to fit into Hong Kong life, but I imagine a lot easier, a lot more difficult to fit into American life, maybe. But I feel like I
Mm.
don't fit in anywhere these days. How about you?
Yeah, I think every place has its own challenges. In actually in Hong Kong, I was plagued by this conflict between Hong Kong and mainland, and I often felt that I don't belong
Hmm.
anywhere. So I don't agree with the values in from mainland. That's the reason I left. But in Hong Kong, sometimes I worry that people would perceive me as an unwelcome settler, right? Because especially over the recent decades, there's more assimilation going on in Hong Kong. Um, I think in some ways, actually moving to the US was a relief because I am just a Asian person, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sometimes, and that can be liberating. And of course, there are certain frustrations with it. There's other types of discrimination. Um, I think I understand what you said, being a nomad, and you don't belong to anywhere, but you also belong to everywhere. So, and every place is changing. I think, what it is really more important is the what kind of people we have in our lives that tied to a certain place.
Yeah.
Sometimes I realize I miss this place. It's not because the place per se, but the people I met, or that kind of yeah, discovery I made. So while I do miss Shanghai and miss Hong Kong, but I'm also happy to be missing it. I'm not wanting to go back. I miss them, but yeah, I'm happy with where I am right now.
No, that's good. That's good. You're a bit more zen about it than I am. I think that's good though. That's good though. It's a very it's a very good thing. It's a very nice thing. So, well, this book is very exciting. We're reaching the end of this conversation, which has been absolutely fascinating. So, why don't you tell us where we can follow you online and where to buy the book?
Okay, so my novel South of the Yangtze is available on Amazon, both in paperback and the Kindle version. I think you can connect me with my website, floraqian.com, FLORAQIAN.com.
Mhm.
I'm on Goodreads, so feel free to follow me there. And I also use Instagram.
Very nice. Very nice. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast. This was fascinating.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. It was great.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal Podcast.